Good morning. I'm Jenna Winters with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. We welcome you today to hear about warblers. We've got biggest week coming up soon. Big deal up in the Northwest. And speaking of the Northwest, I would like to introduce Lauren Broderick Stewart, who is the naturalist at Maumee Bay. Lauren is a huge warbler fan herself. Birds are her specialty. So she's going to have an awful lot to talk to you guys about today. So welcome, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Jenna. So like Jenna said, I am based out of Maumee Bay State Park, which is very fortunate that I like birds because I get a lot of birds this time of year. Right now we're kind of at the beginning of our big, not only warbler migration, but neotropical bird migration. So we just had our early first waves come in, and actually last night we had a whole bunch come in as well. But what specifically I'm going to be talking about today is the Warblers of Ohio. We actually have quite a few that are found in Ohio. There's about 38 species that breed in North America, but 37 of those are regularly found in Ohio, or Eastern North America, excuse me, there's more than that. But 37 can be regularly found in Ohio, and we actually have 25 that nest here, which is awesome. The warblers are interesting. They can be kind of a challenge to identify, basically because of how they forage and how small they are. They are very restless birds. They are all over the place. And so it can be hard to actually pick them out of the trees and actually figure out what bird you're looking at. We're fortunate up here by Lake Erie. It actually takes longer for spring to visit us. Our trees aren't really leafed out right now. So it's a big difference up here than it is in Southern Ohio. Southern Ohio has blooming wildflowers. They have leafed out trees. We are just getting the early spring wildflowers to start to bloom, like spring beauties, and our trees still have buds on them. So it's kind of almost a perfect storm of good warbler identification this time of year because we can see them in the trees, and they're all coming at once because they're flying over Lake Erie. And I'm going to talk about that migration next. So it is quite the adventure for these birds, a lot of them. They're migrating from great distances. So they are neotropical migrants, which means they are wintering in Mexico, Central America, and South America, and then they're flying up here to breed. It is a great deal of distance that they're having to cover, and there's a lot of hazards along the way as well. And this next bird is the Blackpole Warbler. They have one of the longest migrations for our warblers. So to remember, wood warblers are neotropical. So again, they're going to be in the tropics, so down south. Most of them actually migrate at night. It is a lot safer for them. There's less predators. Doesn't mean that there's no predators, but it means there's less that they have to worry about them than during the day. These birds, and I'll give you an example of the sizes of them. This is a Canada warbler. It's a little bit bigger than some of them. These are how big these birds are. They are tiny, and so they only weigh a few ounces. So it takes a lot of energy, and they burn a lot of calories flying these great distances. So they basically have to be able to consume enough food to make it their whole migration route. But they face a lot of man-made obstacles as well as natural barriers, and I'll get in depth a little bit more of those. But here's our Blackpole Warbler. This actually breaks down what the pre-weight was and what the weight was after migration. So the difference between their migrations is oftentimes during the season. So if they're doing their spring migration, they actually tend to go more along the land. And the reason is that they're in their breeding plumage, and it takes a lot more energy to maintain that. So they have to actually eat along the way. But versus fall, when they're no longer breeding, they just want to get back to those wintering grounds. They tend to do the shortest distance, which tends to be over water. So for this particular Blackpole Warbler, they actually had it tagged, and it flew 72 hours nonstop over the Atlantic Ocean. And these are teeny tiny birds that weigh like as much as a pencil. So it's pretty incredible to see what they can do and how they're able to survive and migrate over these great distances year and year after each other. But what's really interesting about this, they often migrate in mixed flocks. So you'll see warblers migrating with other species of warblers, and sometimes you get a really cool fallout. That's essentially like either the weather turned really bad, or the winds blew them wrong way, or they have to stop, or even overnight they finally reach a spot where they just need a resting point. And there's actually some pictures that I'm going to show you, but these birds are migrating to the north to Canada. A lot of them are. And on Makia Seal Island, they had a huge fallout. So this is actually located in the Atlantic Ocean. It's right off kind of like Maine and New Brunswick. And overnight, they have these birds, like literally, if you look at the picture, all of those little dots are different species of warbler. They were literally just everywhere. So you're seeing Blackpole Warblers with Magnolia Warblers, with ovenbirds, with American Redstars. They're just flying in huge mass flocks. So literally if you look along this stairway, you're seeing birds literally littering this area here, this island by this lighthouse. Just hundreds of these birds, thousands of these birds. And this happens. This really does. You can sometimes see that, especially in the Lake Erie Islands. All of a sudden, the islands will basically get bombarded overnight, and especially if they have really bad storms. This is where you get these fallouts of these birds. So with the migrations, you get a lot at a time, and it's really neat to see. We actually had a really big migration last night. Actually, on the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Facebook page, you can actually see they shared U.S. Fish and Wildlife's infographic where they share, it's almost like a heat map, so you can see all these birds are where they ended up. It's a very neat, those migrations can pop up. So the hazards of migrations. The biggest hazards tend to actually be human hazards. These birds are flying, because they're flying in the springtime often through the land. So they're having to deal with developed areas. Cities in particular tend to be a big death trap for a lot of these birds. Not only the buildings, there's no food there for a good portion of them, or there's not enough food. You're worried about window strikes. The lights from the cities, remember, they're flying at night. So the lights from the cities can actually disorient them and impair their ability to migrate. They don't have any habitat for the stopover sites, so they're exhausted and they end up in a place where they don't have anything to eat. The water, they don't know where the water is, or the water's not what they don't have the correct search image for that water because it's blocked by cities and reflective windows. And then you're getting predators. So there's plenty of birds and natural predators that live in the city, but you're also getting the non-native species such as things like cats and whatnot, and even dogs that can be an issue for the birds migrating through via land. So this is actually a graph showing migration routes and essentially the light pollution. And you can see these birds are migrating, and they're having to migrate through these really densely populated areas that have a lot of light pollution, and it can really be a big issue for them and whether or not they actually are able to migrate. So this is Lights Out. Audubon does a really cool program called Lights Out, where they're basically encouraging people to turn the lights out when they can, especially when there's a big migrations happening. So about 1 in 10 songbirds that migrate through cities actually have window collisions, and window collisions actually kill about 40% of these birds. So it's really important to try to basically help these birds migrate by preventing window strikes when we can, and reducing light pollution when we can as well. So there's some big movements to make basically more bird-friendly communities, and turning your lights out during migration time is really important when you can. I know it's not possible for all places, but it will really help the birds when you can do it. So window strikes kills about 1 in 10 migratory birds, which you might, okay, well, that doesn't look like, that might, I mean, it's sad that that happens, but that doesn't seem like a big number. It actually can be a huge number and actually really impact some of our more vulnerable songbird populations. Our songbirds are not only impacted by their breeding grounds, such as up here and their migration to the breeding grounds, they're actually heavily impacted by their wintering grounds as well. We can control what happens up here in North America, but we really can't control about the habitat loss that may happen in the neotropics. So reducing it up here is really important, and there's also been a big push to preserve those wintering grounds in the south as well. There's different techniques that you can use for window strike to prevent window strikes and reduce window strikes. Here at Maumee Bay, we actually had to put basically a giant net above one of our bird viewing windows, one of our wildlife viewing windows. We have huge floor-to-ceiling windows in the back, and we would have multiple birds strike it, and we put up a window net, and that basically reduced the mortality to essentially 0. So that's just something to consider, putting nets up, especially if you're getting birds that were repeatedly hitting your windows in certain areas. You can put decals. Decals aren't super duper effective, but they're better than nothing. Basically putting up something that breaks up the reflection and breaks up the shape of the window really helps. Putting strings or straps that run horizontally or vertically will help as well. But that's just something to consider for window strikes. If you're constantly having birds hit your one window that maybe in your front yard, you might want to put up some method to help prevent that, because even one bird can matter in terms of keeping the population stable. So this is the 2010 migration in Toronto. All of these birds died in that spring migration. These are birds that were collected that week in Toronto. In 2016, 21,000 birds were killed that year from window strikes in the city of Toronto. And Toronto is really important because it's right across us in the lake, and Lake Erie in particular is a pinch point for a lot of the migration. So they have to cross that lake. And so a lot of them are being funneled right here on the western side of Lake Erie and ending up over towards Toronto. And so they get a great deal of these neotropic migrants, and unfortunately a lot of them are dying. They actually have a whole coalition there called FLAP, which is basically there to help prevent bird loss in the city of Toronto, and they've made some great measures to try to reduce this mortality of the songbirds. But 21,000 birds in 2016 died in the city of Toronto from window collisions, which is just crazy to think of. So even though they migrate at night, it does reduce the predators, but they still have some predators. In particular, one of the nighttime predators they have to worry about are these little owls here. They're going to be out and active at night. Screech owls can be a big one. You can even have the larger owls, such as the barred or the great horned owls, even feeding on these birds as well. Cats are a huge one. Keep your cats indoors if you can. Really important to reduce not only bird death, but other native species mortality as well. A big one here that the warblers have to worry about are the Cooper's hawks. They are adapted to be in the wooded areas. They know how to fly through the trees and whatnot, and they can really prey on warblers pretty easily. So the warblers are very small. Like I mentioned, they're actually about the size of a chickadee, to give you kind of some perspective. This one right here is a yellow warbler, a very common one here at Maumee Bay. But they come in such large groups, and they're exhausted from flying these great distances. They're actually really easy prey, unfortunately, because they're just so tired. So helping reduce that mortality by avoiding window strikes and keeping your pets indoors is really important. On to identification. Identification can be tricky. It is kind of tied to basically when, where, why, and what, and how, like to try to determine what birds you're seeing. So, and they're also very different depending on the season. Their plumage is really different in fall than it is in spring. Spring warblers are vastly easier to identify than fall warblers, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the big keys to how to identify. The one that is best used is when. What time of year is it? A lot of these birds come at different times of year, and they come at different times of year depending on where you are within the state of Ohio. Southern Ohio gets warblers way before we do in Northwest Ohio. So that's things like that. And then where are you, the location of the bird? Not only where within the state, but where do you find the bird? Are you finding it on the ground like the upland birds? Or are you finding it really high up in the trees like some of the Cape May warblers maybe? Field marks, always important, the general field marks to know, to kind of help narrow down. My favorite is why. Why am I trying to identify fall warblers? I struggle with fall warblers. Some of them I can get, but there's just a couple, and I'll show you why. They can be really, really hard to identify. And then how. Behavior of the bird is a really big one. Feeding behavior, singing behavior. The birds that nest in Ohio are going to sing. The birds that are just passing through, you're not really going to hear them singing, because there's no reason for the sing, because they're not nesting here, so they're not going to waste their time calling for mates. When they're not going to be here anyways. So things like that can really help you narrow down the birds that you are seeing. So when? This can kind of give you an idea of how timing really can matter. So in early March, this is actually in Toronto, Canada, which is very close to the birds that we're seeing up here in Northwest Ohio. So early March, you're hardly seeing a whole bunch of different species of the neotropical birds. You're not really going to see very many. As we're creeping into April, we're starting to see more, and then you're getting into those first and second weeks of May, and that's when we're getting our high diversity of species. So timing can really, really, really be a big key in identifying and helping narrow down what species you're seeing, because we have some warblers that are early warblers. We're only going to really see them at the beginning of the migration, and we have some warblers that we're seeing almost into June. So that's just things to consider. So our early migrators, we can get them as early as I've seen them. Like I've seen Yellowrumped as early as April 1st, but oftentimes here up in Northwest Ohio, our early warblers are going to be our super early ones, like our palm or our Yellowrumped, or the southern warblers that basically got a little too ambitious when they were migrating and overshot their breeding grounds. So those include things like the worm-eating warbler, the Yellowthroat, and the Kentucky warbler. However, our black and whites, palms, pines, yellow, and Yellowrumped, we tend to see a little bit earlier. The first ones I almost always see are the Yellowrumped, and they're going to be one of the most common warblers that you see, especially in Northwest Ohio. They're everywhere. And it's so fun. I'll be looking for birds. I'm like, oh, I see warbler, I see warbler. And it's like, oh, it's another Yellowrumpt, which I love Yellowrumpts, but you're constantly going to be seeing them and think that, oh, maybe it's a magnolia, but nope, another Yellowrumped. So our first wave. So this is the first wave of our big neotropical migrants and mixed flocks. Late April to early May. So usually we see them first week of May is when they're typically pretty reliably here. And that's going to be one of my favorites, the black-throated blue warblers. They're gorgeous, and they can also be very common here in the park, as well as things like our black-throated green. So the black-throated blue and black-throated green are well named in the sense for the green, at least it's black-throated. Black-throated green is going to be in the top right-hand corner, black-throated blue, bottom left-hand corner. Blackburnian, which are just their flame, they have the flame-colored throat. That's going to be the top left corner. And our Cape May is going to be on the bottom right corner. And our chestnut-sided, which is amply named with its chestnut side, is going to be right in the middle there. Those we can reliably see in early May. But again, these birds, their migration is very weather dependent. If we're having northeast winds from the lake, basically keeping these birds pushed back if they're flying into headwind, we might see them closer to the second week of May. So it's a lot of effort to fly up here. And if we're having terrible weather, they're not going to fly very far. Our second wave, we're seeing them more midway. So they're more mid-May. So it's more of that second week that we see them. Again, also very wind dependent. Oftentimes here in early May, we're still in the 50s. This year, we're actually getting a lot warmer weather. But I mean, it can be really bad weather here in early May. So we might get a lot of our first wave birds mixed in with that second wave as well. So again, very wind dependent. If we're having those northeast headwinds, they're not going to be here when they on the early side of it. The baby-breasted warbler, which is going to be on that right-hand side, is an awesome one to see. They're very, very cool, and they're actually very, very common here as well. The magnolia warbler on that top left-hand side, Blackpole on the bottom left-hand side, Wilson's warbler, who's wearing the little kind of beret at the bottom right, and then one of my favorites, the American Redstar, is right in the middle there. So they come in a variety of colors. They're all about the same size, and they all have very similar feeding patterns for the most part. They're gleaners, so they're insectivores. They're looking for insects. So they're all going to be going up and down the trees, looking in leaves, foraging around, and very, very busy. And then some of our later ones can be May all the way through early June, especially in Northwest Ohio. You're looking at the Connecticut Warbler, the Mourning, Canada, Wilson's, and Redstar. And it can be hit or miss with sometimes the Canada and the Mourning. Some can come late, some can come early, but those both are very rare. And as you notice, we have the American Redstar twice. It's because they sometimes can be later than normal, or they have an extended wave of migration as well. So where the bird is formed, where the bird is found, and geography of Ohio can really make a difference determining what species you have. Northwest Ohio has warblers that southwest or southern Ohio may not have. So here's some examples of northern birds. You're not really going to get the Kirkland warbler, which is on the top right-hand side in southern Ohio. You're probably not going to get the Mourning warbler in southern Ohio or the Connecticut. The Mourning is going to be on the bottom right, and the Connecticut is going to have that nice eye-ring on the top left. The golden-winged warbler as well, not as common in southern Ohio, nor the Canada warbler, which is right in the middle. So that can really make a difference in determining what birds you may be seeing. And here's just some examples of the prevalence of where we're finding these birds. So the golden-winged warbler, you'll see the Lucas, Ottawa County is going to have that lighter lavender purple, versus Adams County and other southern Ohio is going to have that kind of magenta. And the prevalence of these birds is very, very low in southern Ohio versus pretty high in comparison for northern Ohio. But then on the flip side, you have some southern Ohio birds that we rarely see, or just on very rare occasions in northwest Ohio. The blue-winged and the worm-eating. So the blue-winged is going to be on the bottom right. The worm-eating is going to be on the top right. Very uncommon in northern Ohio. The Louisiana water thrush, top left, not common at all. Kentucky warbler is going to be found where you might think closer to Kentucky. Very, very uncommon in northwestern Ohio. And that's going to be on the bottom left. And the yellow-throated, which is well named, is right in the middle there as well. Again, not as common in northern Ohio. And this graph just shows kind of the opposite of it did the other one. It's going to be almost all found in southern Ohio. And then even more common for some of them, especially like if you look at the Louisiana water thrush, it's more common statewide than it is in northwest Ohio. So that is just something to consider as well. Knowing where you're looking can kind of help narrow down to some species that you may not see in certain parts of Ohio. So what? The description of the bird is really vital to determining the species. So you got to be able to describe the bird. This is the field marks are really good for identification. And you don't have to know necessarily the names of the exact field marks, but knowing kind of the general locations is really important. I like this because it's kind of color coded and it'll kind of help you narrow down, okay, it's like, well, did this area really have any streaking? Was there an eye ring? Did it have anything on its crown? Things like that. And it can kind of help you use the process of elimination. Again, warblers can be hard to identify because oftentimes you're looking straight up. So you're not really looking at the side profile of the bird. You're basically looking at the bottom of its tail. Or they're moving so fast you only get a quick glimpse of them. So just a general color scheme of the bird can be really important. And you want to use this in combination of the time of year and location of the bird to help identify. Because sometimes birds may have similar field marks, but the location will really help differentiate what birds you're seeing. So here's another simpler one, breaking down the different parts of the bird and where you should use for field marks. As well as I like to use the 4-zone ID, so head, shoulders, knees, and tails instead of toes, to kind of help describe of like, okay, so what was on its head? What did I see on its shoulders, on its back? What about its knees or bellies and its tail? I kind of like to break it down that way, especially because these birds are moving so fast. I might only get to see the head, or I might only get to see the tail, or I might only be looking at its belly. So Like I mentioned, these birds are all over the place. So silhouettes are something sometimes you may only get to see. And that can help you break it down. Is like, okay, is this a warbler or is this another migrant? Warblers are going to kind of have that very distinctive songbird, perching bird look to them. They're going to look like a generic bird. The gnatcatchers, I like them. They kind of look like they're hunched over all the time. They're very, very vocal, and they have that long tail that they like to flick. Thrushes are going to be bigger. They're going to be stockier, heavier. They're also going to be more on the ground. You're not going to really see them high up in the trees, and they're going to be much bigger than the warblers are. And the wrens, they can be warbler size, but they tend to hold their tail up very rigidly versus the warblers do. So that's a good way to help break down the birds as well as you're seeing. If you get a silhouette, you can break down, okay, did I see a warbler or did I see another migrant or whatnot? Color impression, I like this one a lot. Kind of the general colors of the bird can help narrow it down. Unfortunately, a lot of our warblers are yellowish. So it might not help for some birds, but it might help for others. Tail pattern, which you're going to be looking at the tail more than you think a lot of times when you're dealing with warblers, is a good one to help identify as well. And there's a bunch of whole different neat guides that can really help you identify. Some break it down like to more of bold patterns, bold field marks to help break down and kind of narrow down what birds you're seeing, versus some get a little bit more detailed. And the warblerguide.com has really good field guide, like just quick guides. They do side finder. They have a 45-degree finder, quick view, which can actually be really useful. And then they have the under view, which is actually super duper useful. Oftentimes when you're out birding, you're going to get that birder's net because you're looking straight up. And a lot of times with warblers, this is what you're seeing. And here's another breakdown of some of the undertails as well. They break it down based on, is the tail dark? Is the tail light? Is it spotted? Whatnot? Or do you have pattern on the tail? Which can be really, really helpful because sometimes you're only going to look at that tail, unfortunately. So there are some commonly confused species. The pine, prairie, and palm, so 3 Ps. The pine is an early migrant. We're going to see them earlier. The prairie you're going to see later in May. The prairie is going to have the more distinctive facial markings versus the pine is going to kind of be a blander look compared to the prairie. The palm is a very early one, and they have a really distinctive tail bob. So if you see a warbler out there that's brownish, yellowish, has some facial markings, but is constantly bobbing its tail, it's very likely that it is a palm warbler. So the Nashville, Connecticut in morning. They're all going to have that grayish head. They're going to have a yellow belly, but the Connecticut in the morning have a bib. Both the Nashville and the Connecticut are going to have that eye-ring, but the Nashville has a yellow throat, and by far you are more likely to see the Nashville than either of the other 2 birds. So the biggest and easiest way to distinguish the morning and the Connecticut is that eye-ring. The Connecticut has it, the morning does not. The morning's bib also tends to be a lot more distinctive. You can see it a lot quicker than the Connecticut's. Connecticut is kind of just a light little bib on its breast. And the morning tends to be much more earlier, and the Connecticut may come later. So those are just things to consider. So the gray and yellow and black birds, the yellow-rumped, yellow-throated magnolia in Canada. So the yellowrumped is very early and is going to be the most common, and they're well named because they have a yellowrumped. Their colloquial name is butterbutt. You'll hear that often when people say, oh, I see another butterbutt. It's that yellow rump that is very distinct. They also have the yellow sides as well, the yellow flanks. Now, the yellow-throated is in the middle, and they have that distinctive yellow throat. They're early, but they're going to be more common in southern Ohio. So in northwest Ohio, I'm not thinking yellowthroat. I'm seeing magnolia or a yellow-rumped. The magnolia, like the yellowthroat, also has a yellow throat. However, its yellow extends through its breast and its belly. That's going to be on the far right-hand side. The Canada lacks the wing bars that the others have, as well as is mostly basically gray and yellow. It doesn't have a lot of the black or white. The Canada is the bottom in the middle, and it has this nice necklace. The males have a nice necklace across its breast, but it has yellow going more into the face, and it has an eye ring. The other two have the half rings. They have like almost just the eyeliner. They don't have the full ring, white rings. So the Cerulean, which are gorgeous, the black-throated blue, and the northern Parula. The Cerulean can come early to late. They're a little harder to time, but they're breeding in southern Ohio. So in northern Ohio, you're not as likely to see a Cerulean. However, the black-throated blues, we're going to get them mid-migration, and they can be very common. But they're going to have that distinctive black throat and black flanks with the white belly. If you're looking at them just from the back and you catch that blue, these birds can look a little bit confusing together. The Cerulean's going to have those ring bars. The Cerulean's on the left-hand side is going to have those wing bars. It's not going to have a lot of black on it. It's mostly going to be blue and white. So northern Parula, they're going to have that kind of rust gold on the back, on their back between their wings, and they're also going to have yellow. So even though they are very, very blue, they're going to have yellow on them, but the other two lack. The northern Parula can come throughout migration, varying more in the middle of migration, and they can be very common as well in both northern Ohio and southern Ohio. So the chestnut-sided and the golden wing can be confused. The chestnut-sided, however, has more white on it. It's going to have that wing barring, but they both are going to just have a very distinctive mask, with the golden wing being much more, it looks like a V, versus the more loose mask of the chestnut-sided. The golden wing is early and they're rare. You're not really going to see very many of them. So you can usually err on the side of what's more common, and it's more likely you're going to be seeing a chestnut-sided than you are going to be seeing a golden-winged. So the black and white warbler and the blackpole, they're both black and white. However, the blackpole on the right-hand side has that distinctive cap. They also have pink feet and pink legs, versus the black and white warbler, which is going to be more black and white overall. They're going to have those darker legs. They're going to have that darker beak. They're not going to have a full cap like the blackpole does. They have a blaze in the middle. They also have an eye ring as well. And they are a lot bolder streaks than the blackpole is. However, it can get confusing, and I'll show you later on. Males and female warblers look very different, and they can look like other species, the females can. So you have some of my favorite, the Prothonotary, which is the warbler on the right-hand side. These are known as swamp candles. They're very, very bright birds that are common. They actually are one of our only cavity nesting warblers, and they nest in the swamp. So they're very fun to see, but they have this kind of ombre look to them. They start off bright yellow and they fade to almost gray, which the blue-winged warbler on the right-hand side also kind of does, but they have wing barring. Blue-winged warblers are going to be in southern Ohio, versus the Prothonotary is going to be found in northwest Ohio, where they breed. Wilsons and yellow warblers. Both these are kind of just yellowish warblers. However, the Wilsons, which is located on the left-hand side, has that distinctive little beret. They're going to be coming later in the season, but yellows are here earlier, and they're breeders as well in northwest Ohio. They're very, very common here. So the Tennessee and the orange-crowned. They can be a little hard to distinguish. They are kind of no real distinct patterning. The Tennessee has the beak, looks like it extends into the eye almost. It has a little bit of a cap. It has a little bit of an eye streak, but they are brownish, yellowish birds. You're more likely here in northwest Ohio to see the Tennessee than you are to see the orange crown. The orange crowns kind of just pass through us pretty quickly. But if you're seeing a bird that doesn't really have many distinctive markings on it, it could be a Tennessee or an orange crowned warbler. So the hooded and black-throated green both have the olive-ish color with the yellow head. However, the hooded, which is on the right-hand side, has that distinct hood to it. So the black-throated green lacks that black on top. They just have the black throat as well. Both of these birds can be found earlier in the migration, and the black-throated greens are breeders, and they have a very distinctive, very buzzy call and song versus the hoodeds. So the Kentucky and the common yellowthroat both kind of have a lot going on their faces there. The Kentucky is early and it's southern Ohio versus the common yellowthroat, which is going to be on the right-hand side, is more mid-migration, and they breed here in northwest Ohio as well. And for blackbirds with orange and yellow, you're only really going to get two of them that are pretty distinctive, and that's the American Redstar and the Blackburnian. The American Redstar kind of resembles a red-winged blackbird. They're much, much smaller, and they hold themselves very differently. They have these bright wing patches when they're active and flying, but overall, they're going to be more black with accents of orange and yellow versus a mix like the Blackburnian. So Blackburnian is going to have that yellow-orange face with heavily streaking. They're going to have wing bars, and they're going to have streaking on their back, and there's white as well, where you're not really going to see a whole bunch of white except on the belly and the rump of the undertail of the Redstar. So the bay-breasted and Cape Bay, like if you're looking up in the trees, it can be, especially if you're looking into the sun, these guys can really resemble each other. However, the Cape May, which is on the right-hand side, they're going to have a lot more streaking on the breast than the bay-breasted will. The bay-breasted is going to have a very dark face and is going to be overall a whiter color. It's not going to have that yellow that the Cape May has overall, that it looks like it's been dipped in. The worm-eating warbler and the red-eyed vireo are often confused. The worm-eating warbler is very, very, very rare, especially in northwest Ohio. It's going to be found in southern Ohio, and it's going to be found earlier in the season versus the red-eyed vireo, which is much more common, and you're going to find it mid-migration. Vireos have a thicker beak. They're going to have bluish gray feet, and they're going to look heavier overall than the worm-eating warbler, and they're not going to have that yellow face that the worm-eating warbler has, that bright face. These are some of the hardest ones to distinguish: the northern water thrush and the Louisiana water thrush. They look very, very similar. So the northern water thrush is going to be on the right-hand side, and the Louisiana is going to be on the left-hand side. The biggest thing is that the shape of the eyebrow of the northern water thrush is going to be narrowing at the rear, and is often going to be more of, have a yellow or buffy overall tone to it. The Louisiana water thrush is going to be brighter and really easy to see that eyebrow, and it doesn't narrow. The bill can also be a way to distinguish. The northern water thrush is going to have the shorter bill, the thinner bill, and it's going to be a little more straight, while the Louisiana has a long, strong, and the lower mandible often appears to be a little bit bent upwards. But the biggest thing is the chin. The northern water thrush is going to have like a finely striped chin, versus the Louisiana water thrush is almost going to look like it has a white chin. So it's a little bit easier to distinguish, especially if the chin can help distinguish the two. Location is going to be the biggest one. So as it may imply, you're going to find the northern water thrush in the north, and the Louisiana water thrush is going to be more common in southern Ohio. Unfortunately, a striped chin can tell us if we have a northern water thrush, but the lack of stripes doesn't tell us for sure that we have the Louisiana water thrush. Some northern thrushes, water thrushes may not have a super finely striped chin. So location really matters on this one as distinguishing the two. Overall, the Louisiana tends to have a wider look to it versus the northern can kind of have a yellowish buffy overall tone to it. The ovenbird is a strange warbler in the sense that it doesn't it doesn't forage how most warblers forage. You often find these guys on the ground. They do look like basically miniature versions of thrushes, and they behave very similar to thrushes in the sense that they're foraging on the ground. However, they have these distinctive kind of blazes on their head. They kind of have an orange crown, as well as they're going to be warbler size. They're much smaller than thrushes, but they're very cute birds. I always love to see them in the park. So our female warblers can be a lot harder to identify easily or immediately than the males. They're not as vocal. They're a lot more secretive, especially the breeders here, because they got to hide from the predators. They're the ones sitting on the eggs. They're going to have more muted colors. They don't need to be seen as easily because they want to have more camouflage. And they're not going to be as vivacious as the males in the sense that they're singing, they're out, they're open and the bold. They're not as bold because they have a different role. So here's an American Redstar, the difference between the two. Basically, the female looks like a less saturated version of the male. They're actually, I really love the female Redstars. They're actually very, very quite gorgeous in person. Here's a northern Parula. Again, looks like a less saturated version of the male as well. Doesn't have as bold as patterning and bold as colors, but you can kind of see how they might look the same. This is where it can get kind of tricky. So the male black and white warbler, pretty distinctive. However, the female can often be confused with a male Blackpole Warbler. The black crown doesn't extend as far in the female as it will in the male Blackpole, but on a side glance, if you see that, you're like, oh, that doesn't look like a black and white warbler. That may be a Blackpole. So here's our Blackpole male warbler. The females kind of look like a sparrow. They don't have that as warblery as look as the Blackpole does, the male does. Here's one of our more common ones, the common Yellowthroat. The female is very bland looking in the sense that may be confused with an orange crown warbler male, just kind of a little brown bird. May even be confused with the wren if you're just getting that from a distance view. They kind of hold their tails up and they're often found in the same areas that wrens may occupy as well. Our Wilson's warbler, the male has that little cap, the female does not, which can get you a little bit confused with the next bird, the female yellow warbler. So that's just something to really consider when you're going in and looking, okay, we know you have a warbler, are you looking at a male or a female? And that can help kind of narrow it down too as well. Especially if you think you have one of the breeding warblers, is it singing, can really help you determine whether you have a male or whether you have a female. Here's our black-throated blue warbler. The female looks much, much different than the males do. They do have a partial ring, eye ring, but they do have the similar white patch of the wing bar as well. On to my favorite, the Y, and that's fall warblers. They look like little brown birds, and they can be very, very difficult. They don't have their breeding plumage. They're not breeding anymore. It's a lot of energy to maintain that, so they lose it, and they can all look fairly similar. So here's some of the hardest ones to distinguish. These are two different species of warbler. We have the Blackpole Warbler on the left-hand side and the bay-breasted on the right-hand side. So you can kind of see why fall warblers are a little difficult to identify because they can be completely different species when they're looking different species when they're in full plumage. And then you get to the non-breeding plumage and you're like, oh, they look all the same. Once the problem is a lot of these in hand, they're easy to distinguish the difference between. In the field, it can be a lot harder. The bay-breasted warblers sometimes have like the bay, like the kind of the chestnuts on their side, on their flanks, and they tend to be slightly larger. They're going to have gray feet versus the Blackpole, which is going to have that yellow feet. So the feet can be one of the distinguishing factors on how you know what kind of bird you have. But oftentimes, especially in fall, there's still leaves on the tree. It's really hard to get good looks at these birds. So here's the two again with the bay-breasted on top and the Blackpole on bottom. If you're looking at these birds very quickly in the field, it can be really hard to distinguish them. There's some really good guides that you can find specific for fall warblers. There's the Advanced Birding Guide. by Peterson, which can be helpful. There's specific warbler only guides, which are nice. Here's the Warblers of the Americas, which is by Kirsten, Quinn, and Beetle, which can be really great. It focuses on warblers on our side of the world, which is great. For the breeding birds, the Division of Wildlife has some amazing guides as well, but it focuses more on the breeding plumages. But they have a Warblers of Ohio guide that you can request print, or it is available online right now for free. It's great. They also have an accompanying book CD guide with the songs as well. But some other helpful hints, especially when you're out in the field trying to determine what you're seeing, take pictures if you can. Sometimes even blurry pictures can make a big difference on help you identifying. You might be able to get just enough where you can see, okay, there's that field mark. Use a field guide. I even have to use a field guide when I'm out there. It just can get, especially when you have a whole bunch of birds at once, it gets almost overwhelming because they come in great numbers, especially if you're in the birding hotspot. Checking eBird is really good because it can you can kind of see what people are seeing that day. So you can be like, okay, well, I think I saw a Blackpole Warbler, and we've had reports of today somebody else saw one, and yesterday they saw one, so that's probably what I did see. Things like that. Again, here's some great resources as well. The Warbler Guide, Kaufman Field Guide to Advanced Birding is a really good one. And one of my favorites is the Cornell Lab of Ornithology Merlin Bird ID. It's a really fun one. They have the calls of the birds on there. Once you load it onto your phone, it's actually an app, both Android and iOS. You do not require to use cellular data once it's downloaded on the phone. So if you're out in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, you still have access to that and all the calls and all the maps and things like that. So that one's a really good one as well. And of course, our Division of Wildlife Warbler Guide is a great one. I know that was a lot of information that I threw at you. Does anybody have any questions?
Mostly what we have, Lauren, is a whole bunch of people who really enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, excellent. I know that was a lot. I highly, highly recommend, if you haven't checked out the Division of Wildlife's field guides, they are awesome. It is, let's see, you probably can't see too much of it, but it gives you essentially like a life history of these birds. When you can see these birds timing wise, it's really in depth for being basically a pocket guide. Highly recommend it. And the Merlin Bird ID app, I love that app. I have to narrow down a lot of the birds. I hear them and I don't see them by song. So I use that very, very frequently. And just as a side note, to remember when you are birding, use birding ethics. It can be really, really exciting to get to see all these awesome birds, but just remember these birds have flown thousands of miles. They are tired, they are hungry. A lot of them that do, we have 25 species that breed here in Ohio. And so just especially when you're using the apps that may have their songs, just be really cognizant that you're not playing it too loud, so it's going to agitate the birds. They're already expended a lot of energy. They don't need to come and scream at your cell phone, basically, because they get really, really territorial, especially the breeding ones. So just make sure you're not causing them to expend any extra energy, because they're so awesome. We want to see them year after year.
Lauren, we'd also do, Kevin had asked if he could get a copy of your slides.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So gave him your email address.
Yep, and there's my email address. I'd be more than happy to send it to you. I know it was a ton of information. Yeah. We were going to do a walk today, but we have thunderstorms, so I decided not to take you guys out in the rain. So
if you're looking for that, up at the top corner of your screen, there's a question and answer box. If you're not aware of it, you can just click on the question mark, and that'll show it to you for Lauren's address. The other thing is, in probably about 3-4 days, maybe a week, this presentation, all of our webinars actually are downloaded and they are put on the OhioDNR YouTube channel. So if you want to go back over this or share it with somebody, you can go check out our YouTube channel. We will post the link for that in just 1 second. Other than that, folks, thank you so much for joining us today. Next week, if you are into birds, join us next week. Jenny Richards from Shawnee, and I think Catherine Connor from Houston Woods will be co-presenting, and they're going to talk about how to make your backyard bird friendly. Thanks a lot, folks.